Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Perhaps we can close the door there in the back and get started. We have a lot to talk about today. I want to welcome all of you to this panel, the Human Rights Response to the Zero Rating Conundrum. My name is Arturo Carrillo. I'm a professor at GW Law School, and I'm honored to be organizing, co-sponsor this panel. We will be taking questions at the end via Slido. Hopefully you all have that routine down by now. The slide will disappear in a minute and be replaced with a different one that's going to provide our normative framework for today's discussion, but it will come back at the end for questions. Manuel, can we go ahead and switch that slide? Thanks. Okay, today we'll be having a dialogue, a discussion around what I call the zero rating conundrum. The fact that zero rating practices curtail net neutrality at the same time that, at least in the developing world, they facilitate access to the internet, or portions of the internet, for people who may not otherwise have it or use it. So there's an apparent conflict between the sanctity of net neutrality principles on the one hand, and the imperative to close the digital divide in developing countries on the other. So that's the conundrum. The intensity of the debates in developing countries around net neutrality and zero rating testifies to the intractability of this conundrum. The anti-zero rating camp is at loggerheads with those who, for a range of different reasons, believe that zero rating practices should be allowed. So in most of these debates, there's no real middle ground. There's no clear basis for compromise, and so the discussions tend to be highly polarized and binary. And that raises the question that I've been thinking about, which is there a single perspective that reasonable people could agree on that would permit fruitful discussion and exchange and enlightened policymaking on these issues? And I believe that there is one, and the answer to that question is the International Human Rights Law Framework, which in pertinent part is summarized for you up on this slide, and we'll be referring back to it in a minute. This panel will examine the human rights law framework, or I should say the framework under international law for analyzing zero rating as a proposed limitation to net neutrality understood as a human rights norm, which net neutrality indisputably is. When viewed this way, zero rating and net neutrality present a conflict of rights: the right to impart and receive information on the one hand, and the right to connectivity or access on the other. As it turns out, human rights has a paradigm, a regime for resolving conflicts of rights, and it's that exceptions regime that we'll be working through today in context, looking at specific situations in different countries around the world. We have 4 countries represented on this panel. Each of those countries has ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. That's the ICCPR that you see projected up here. And as such, are bound to those obligations under international law. I will proceed by asking a couple rounds of questions of each of the panelists and engaging in this dialogue with them before opening it to a discussion from the public via Slido. It's important to note that this human rights law framework that we'll be referring to applies to roughly 80% of the countries in the world. It is in fact a universal framework of principles that apply to net neutrality discussions, or should apply, and that at least is what we're trying to illustrate today. So let's see how that works. Let's start talking first about net neutrality as such. Article 19 that you see up here of the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, sets out the standard for freedom of expression that we're all familiar with. It is well settled that the constituent rights that comprise freedom of expression will apply to all internet-based forms of communication. So there's no issue there. As a result of that, however, it's important to recognize that international experts from the United Nations and other regional human rights bodies have recognized that net neutrality is an integral element of the freedom of expression. It is part and parcel of freedom of expression today, net neutrality as a norm. So what that means, as a practical matter, is that no state subject to this universal regime of human rights can be said to be respecting freedom of expression if it is not taking measures to guarantee net neutrality. So that's our starting point, right? Net neutrality is a norm of human rights. So I'm going to put Claudio on the spot first here. Lucky you. All of them will be on the spot at some point, so don't worry about that. Of all the countries represented on this panel, Claudio, Chile has gone the furthest in protecting net neutrality in legislative and normative terms. Can you tell us a little bit about the protections of net neutrality in Chile and how you got them?
Sure. Thank you for the invitation. I'm pretty proud to be join you today. Yeah, our law is from 2010, and the Chilean regulation on net neutrality is always seen as the first country in the world to regulate this hot topic. I know that Miguel is here. Miguel also has always been kicking me back with that in terms of that Peru basically apparently has a older regulation. But this is not a race about...
Right, we're not going to fight about that. Okay.
This is not a race about Chile and Peru because we love each other.
It's not Pisco we're talking about, right?
It's not Pisco, no.
Sorry, I couldn't resist.
So sorry for that. But
yeah.
What I'm trying to say is, in our regulation, I think there's a couple of things which are very interesting to discuss somehow. Mm-hmm. The first of all is, it's true that our regulation was one of the first in the world, but the thing is, how do we get there?
Yeah.
And the reason why we get there is pretty interesting, and I think it's not being addressed pretty well in the international discussion.
Does it involve human rights? Is there a human rights dimension to that?
Yes and no. That would be my point.
Ask you to statement within 3 minutes. Okay.
That would be my point.
All right.
So, and it won't take me that long.
Okay.
The thing is, the regulation in Chile was really quick. Mm-hmm. It was in less than 6 or 8 months. We already had the law during all the Congress procedures. And the reason why was because the way that the neutrality regulation and the neutrality discussion was based wasn't in human rights, wasn't in any sort of zero rating sort of policies or access policies at all, but was more about transparency in the way that the connection between consumers and companies was made, okay, which is pretty Chilean and pretty neoliberal, of course, so that's the reason why we get there. So I wanted to say this because I think that the connection between neutrality, human rights, and zero rating practices are important in terms of to have that discussion in the framework of the human rights system, but at the same time, I think it's important as well to take into account local realities. And local realities in Latin America, for instance, and of course, Carlos will agree with me on this, it's about market concentration, market integration, and the lack of enforcement in our government agencies and so on, so on. I will go deeper into that in the Chilean practices, but I think that's, as a starting point, I think
that's a great starting point, and we will be talking about those local contexts quite a bit. And since you referenced Carlos, why don't we just turn to him, staying within Latin America. So Mexico has, I understand, has recently undergone a constitutional reform and adopted a net neutrality legislation, and would love to hear a little bit about how that process has gone and what the human rights implications of net neutrality protections in Mexico are like right now.
Well, when you want to interpret net neutrality into Mexican legislation, you will want to go back all the way to 2012 for a human rights reform. Yeah. That basically there's several principles of interdependency and non-division and the pro persona principle, but also the telecommunication reform you refer that was 2 years after that reformed the whole chapters of freedom of expression and the Article 7 in Mexico that is very important to take into account. Of the Constitution, yes, this is constitutional level. Because in Mexico it's forbidden the prior censorship, and that's when we talk about these human rights terms. For example, the prior censorship is not forbidden in the European system, for example. So in terms of our regional case, we have a set of instruments that may work better. But also in the Article 6 in Mexico's constitution, there were some discussions that are in the international level of the neutrality discussion were just solved. For example, this whole FCC debate around public information service versus the public utility. It's a public utility of general interest, and Mexican state should be sure that telecommunication services are provided with these, and these principles. That's on the constitutional level. And then came the law, right? And we have in the law a neutrality chapter in telecommunications law, and it's a good one because it's principle based. Different to some other legislations. I'm thinking on Brazilian Marco Civil, for example. Yeah. It's principles based, and it deposits in the regulator, who is also very different because it's a constitutionally autonomous regulator. It's independent. It's independent from the presidency, so it's like a 4-branch of power. That also is not only telecommunications regulator, but also antitrust authority at the same time. So it's very complex. And the whole case for protecting neutrality is there in terms of undoubtedly, there are protections. It's a very different approach, but is there in the zero rating? 1 minute on the zero rating. Well, for zero rating,
Well, we're going to get there in the next round.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well,
But just to highlight, so you're saying that net neutrality protections in Mexico are at a constitutional level. They're in the Constitution.
yes.
And that's not true, I think, of Chile, right? Right. So that's a very important.
Yeah, because there was no obligation at all
Right.
for bringing it to the law. And actually, when you talk to the lawmakers, they said that the protection is explicitly there.
No, but that's
They don't say
significant.
the N word in the Constitution as they don't say another.
I
word
see what
for
you're
it.
saying. I see what you're saying. Good. Okay. Well, thank you. So now moving to other parts of the world where net neutrality hasn't quite yet achieved the same level of protection as we've seen in these two Latin American countries. Faria, perhaps you could talk to us about how this issue looks like in Pakistan and what the state of the discussion on net neutrality specifically looks like.
Well, in Pakistan, it's next to non-existent, actually, the debate on net neutrality. And I'll tell you a few reasons for this. In other jurisdictions or other countries of the world, legislation has progressed in a particular direction. Regulation has progressed in it. And when I say regulation, not just like negative regulation, but positive regulation in terms of sort of countering market forces. Neighboring India, for instance, is, miles and miles ahead, and we have to catch up. Article 19, which is freedom of expression in the Constitution of Pakistan, that also has not been legislated upon. So all we have is an article of the Constitution, but there's no supporting legislation. So whereas we have legislation for access to information and Freedom of Information Acts, Article 19 is just as is. And so it's a very primitive debate in terms of internet rights. We still go through network disruptions.
Okay.
We still experience blanket censorship. And those are sort of still the issues that you're grappling with.
So it's the
over
issue
there.
of the future in many ways.
Right.
It's happening around you, and it's a question of time, but you're not quite there yet. Let me ask you this. As a digital rights activist, do you see that human rights arguments, Article 19 from the treaty and the way that it might overlap or overlay with the law in Pakistan, do you think there are arguments there or bases that you can use to advocate in favor of strong net neutrality protections, relying on the human rights norms? How do you view that strategy as an advocate?
Definitely. So what we're looking we're basically, we have an observer status where net neutrality debates are concerned, right? Looking at other
Right, Bolo Vida,
jurisdictions,
yeah.
and then so because I feel like we have an unlegislated space, it offers us the opportunity that when we go in that direction, what direction do we want to head in?
Great.
So the ICCPR, like you said, we're a signatory, we've ratified it. There's Article 19, again, for expression. So
Yep.
when we do move in the direction of legislation,
You'll be
those are
there.
some of the things that, and it's already a reminder that's been served to legislators in combating the cybercrime bill, saying, well, here's a human rights framework, and you need to adhere to it, and you have certain international obligations as well as local constitutional obligations, and so we need to be cognizant of these parameters.
How relevant will the experiences of other countries like these up here with you on the panel, how relevant will those be or useful in that kind of advocacy when the time comes?
Fairly useful because there's obviously a theoretical dimension, a principled view that everybody's taken on net neutrality, and then there's a more practical aspect of it. And I feel like, especially
Right.
because when it's a practical aspect, then there's we have a very heavy corporate culture, and when you're talking about free market economics and that the economic dimension also comes in.
Right.
And we're also a country where people are still getting connected. Internet penetration is not reached
Very
the
low.
level.
Yeah.
We just got 3G, 4G last year, so those are all factors that are going to weigh into
Great.
this debate.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful. Okay. Well, moving to Africa, comparatively, the discussion of net neutrality seems of distant relevance to most people, at least at this point for the time being. How do you see, Benga, this playing out in Nigeria, kind of in light of the different examples we've heard of so far?
So it's probably closer to Pakistan than
Yeah.
it is to Mexico or Chile. And the reason for that isn't, is quite obvious to most people, at least within Nigeria. So it's like the conversation is at 3 levels.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not the formal definition within the country, but this is the way it looks like. It looks like at one level you've got bread, the other level you've got broadband, and the other level you've got blah, blah, blah. And unfortunately at this moment, things like net neutrality seem to be blah, blah, blah. There were 2 times when
That's the most eloquent description I've ever heard of that topic.
We're very close
Right.
to having this conversation
I know what you're saying.
at 2 times. One was when we started having this conversation around broadband plan for Nigeria into 2018. But it was a limited conversation because the people who were in the room having that conversation were people who were quite connected within the global space in terms of this conversation. So it was limited to that roundtable, so to speak. The second time was when obviously the market share leader in Nigeria, MTN, acquired the GSM market leader acquired the last standing CDMA company, which people kind of talked about, fair practices. The conversation almost got to issues around net neutrality, but the interests around the acquisition are not exactly up for debate.
So what needs to happen for net neutrality to become squarely, part of the discussions and debates as a policy matter?
So I think that the acquisition may just lead to that conversation because the acquisition means that the market leader is a lot more powerful, and I think we're going to see reactions from the other players in the market and this is probably going to be a purely market-driven conversation at the beginning,
right?
Where other companies are going to say, you know what, this is unfair because you're the market leader and now you're acquiring another company, and that's going to be unfair practices. That's what I think will bring the conversation.
Good. No, that makes sense, and it seems to follow the direction that other countries have also the path that they've been on. So that I think that I want to say so. Given that net neutrality, as we're framing it, is a norm of human rights, and because it's integral to freedom of expression in the modern world, zero rating practices can be best understood as proposed limitations on freedom of expression, if we're going to work within this framework, which is what we're doing now. And this is one reason why they're so contentious, right? Because there are limits on freedom of expression. But there are a few points that I want to highlight to develop further this framework before turning the floor back to each of you to discuss zero rating now concretely. The first principle is that just as net neutrality has been uploaded into the modern human rights legal framework, so too has the right to access or connectivity. Both are integral elements of freedom of expression in the modern legal framework. Can't go into the details right now, but suffice it to say that, and this is a quote from the UN Human Rights Committee, which has established this, that giving effect to the right to freedom of expression imposes an obligation on states to promote universal access to the internet. So it is part and parcel of freedom of expression as well. The second point is that no human right is absolute, and net neutrality is no exception. As you can see from the ICPR framework, paragraph 3 of Article 19 allows for exceptions to freedom of expression in certain limited, I will stress, limited circumstances, and we'll talk more about that. What this means, these two observations, what they mean as a practical matter, is that measures to promote connectivity will clash with freedom of expression understood as the right to impart or receive information freely, setting up this conflict of rights that I was discussing, that I pointed to at the outset. And that is where I want our discussion to sort of focus on now. So let's turn to Mexico to kick off this discussion, where just this kind of net neutrality debate is raging. You have a strong normative framework now. You have an agency that's basically a fourth branch of government. We have certain practices that your organization, R3D, has documented in a really good report on the issue of net neutrality in Mexico. So, Carlos, why don't you describe for us how the zero rating practices are taking place, and your thoughts on those from a human rights perspective?
Well, first the last one. Yes, zero rating, and I agree with you. It's been put into a binary situation.
Yeah.
But also, when you try, it happens a lot. When you say, there's a lot of people, especially in the surveillance, for example, discussion that is next door. You have a lot of agencies that the first thing they say is, human rights are not absolute. But they don't understand that because they come to the conclusion that by not being absolute means blank check.
Right, that's right.
And no one means that, though.
No.
So the accent is not there. So yes, zero rating, there are a lot of zero rated services. Pranesh has a good taxonomy of the zero rated possibilities. There are many. I mean, I have found some that seem very interesting. New Zealand, for example, has zero rated some matches, soccer, football matches, or even public channels at some point. But yeah, the whole question is interfering the obligation to bring connectivity and this possibility of zero rating have their own ramp effect, the famous Facebook argument that has for free basics, that is the on-ramp effect. Poor people need to know that internet is great. Poor people need to know that internet is great. We are going to bring this possible solution, and they will want to put some income into having the full internet. So they need,
Are you seeing that happen in practice or not?
that's the problem, that there's no studies, there's no data about it. But even I think that may false question, because even the on-ramp effect doesn't, even if we have 10 years of data on the on-ramp effect, the whole argument may have to be a human rights issue, because the interference itself is the problem. It has to be measured as well in the surveillance, for example, in this surveillance discussion. It has to be weighted in the necessity, proportionality, legality, and all those stuff. Because yes, it's for example, Facebook says free basics is an information tool. Yes, but it's an information tool that brings entry barriers for other information tools, probably. So are those entry barriers outweighed, by the benefit effects? And that's the question that a human rights perspective or a human rights test has to do. So
Is that related to the market landscape in Mexico and the concentration of...
my first intuition, having said that, is a process to apply that process for every single zero rating model that there is. My first intuition is that most of the zero rated services or possibilities are to be banned because it's also contextual. In the case of Mexico, this high concentration, having one player having 89.1% of the whole broadband, mobile broadband, maybe the effects on the market will be terrible. And also when you have this, not only is an ISP, because the ISP is also content producer, is also video game producer, is also the problem is it's a concentration matter.
Okay.
And the effects are local, have to be delivered country by country with different.
So the concentration of the telco and the market means that these zero rating plans that you're describing, even if they do have an sort of on-ramping effect, might still be more harmful than not, given the lay of the land in Mexico under those circumstances.
Probably, but the whole analysis to understand if the exception is legitimate and passes the test of the human rights test will have to be will have to take into account all of that. No?
Has R3D done that type of analysis?
We are now in the next August will be the consultation for the rulemaking process. So we don't really have enforcement of any kind for neutrality. But what Carlos Slim is doing is he's doing all his effort to do every single possibility of zero rating services he can do. He hasn't come that far as Verizon, for example, or companies, but he's going that way. So
which skews the market even further, right? What you're saying.
Yeah, that's the point.
Right.
So the problem is when the regulation comes, if it comes, it will find an even more concentrated market.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a very interesting perspective, unique to Mexico, but I think also illustrative of the dynamics of how this looks in practice. Let's turn to Pakistan. Completely different situation as we discussed a moment ago. Of the four countries, Pakistan has the deepest digital divide. 14% of people have access to the internet or use the internet at all. So it would seem, at least from a connectivity point of view, that some zero rating might be useful in that context. What do you think?
So again, the two distinctions, right? From a practical perspective, any debate, I think, is close to what Benga said, right? It's going to be a clash of market forces in terms of competition and who competitive advantage, and is it a level playing field or is somebody getting it? So we do have a competition commission in Pakistan, and in the telco sector that has been settled, in terms of monopoly of the largest ISP, etc. So I feel like we will see those debates emerge eventually over there. But the theoretical aspect of it, yes, so we don't have a lot of people connected. So why is it such a bad thing? At least, but the whole something is better than nothing approach, so that's damaging in the long term. Treat it as the world of shadows, right? So here people are sitting facing the wall of the cave and they're looking at these shadows and they think this is the internet. But that's not the internet, right? You just need to turn around, crawl out of that cave and see, oh no, but there's so much more there.
Right.
The problem is, so internet.org has been launched in Pakistan.
It has been,
recently. It
yeah.
has been with one. So Telenor launched internet.org.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the most problematic part of it is the marketing aspect, the perception that is created, that this is the internet. So for somebody who is completely unfamiliar with the internet would think these 14-something applications
Yeah.
or whatever is the internet. But that's not true.
No, that's a very serious risk. So you're talking about the effects from the perspective of proportionality or adequacy, right? And that's what you want to be doing. Some folks have suggested that there are variations or ways of perhaps configuring some of these practices that will reduce that problem. So, for instance, the Center for Democracy and Technology has a series of criteria that they proposed in the assessment of when a zero rating plan right, the benefits may outweigh the harms. And one of those factors is user education, right? Explaining to people when you roll out a plan that it is not the internet and how, and with full transparency, which is another factor. How would that fold into the analysis of what's possible in Pakistan?
That's something, so, I mean, the telecom sector is regulated, right?
Yeah,
And
well,
that's how
the other
it started.
question, right.
And so, again, misleading advertising is something that they can tackle. And so the regulator can weigh in on that, or that's a challenge that you can. So I think the emerging debate would be along those lines, where you bring that to the public
So
eye.
the regulator would be the one that have to...
Or the citizens, that's something that you can leverage, because like I
Right.
said, there's no other law to really turn to. So that would be one thing that you could leverage in terms of initiating the debate, right? Look,
Right.
we need to, so there has to be a very clear distinction because we do operate in a free market economy.
Right.
So obviously there's also the role, you can't infringe on the role of the private sector as well. But at the same time,
Can you say a little bit more
what are the
about that?
parameters
Yeah.
within which the private sector should operate, right?
Okay.
I think those are still sort of
Got it.
initial debates.
So that the importance of defining those parameters for the operation of the private sector and how the regulator, because it's really the regulator's job to do that, isn't it?
Right, and
And how to
corporate
do that
social
in an enlightened way.
responsibility.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Excellent. Okay. Well then let's come back to Benga. So no African country has banned zero rating. And many African countries allow it for a number of reasons. The most common zero-rated platforms and plans. You and I talked about how, for instance, the Kenyan Minister of Communication came out saying that net neutrality was a first world problem, and that zero rating, at least in his country, was a viable option because, a loaf of bread to starving people was preferable to, the future prospect of a full balanced meal. How do you feel the future of zero rating in Nigeria will look like? What's happening now? Are there zero rating activities going on? And what do you think that debate will look like as it evolves?
So there are from various telcos, but for four things that I want to quickly touch on, and I think they're important. Because we have this conversation all the time, and the people that we're trying to connect to the internet are not in the room. So we have two sides that are having the same, maybe not the same, who have more education than them, and unfortunately, they don't get the opportunities. The impression they have is, at least I have some education, right? So I should have opportunities. But unfortunately, you're competing against people who have more education, so you don't have opportunities. That, first of all, you miss opportunity. Secondly, it leads to a terrible inferiority complex. And I think it's going to be the same thing when, I like the idea of saying, if I'm the first person introducing you to, in quotes, the internet or internet opportunities, I have the responsibility to explain to you that this is not the full internet. But unfortunately, what happens then is that in many cases, this doesn't happen in many cases, right? It's sold as the internet. One of the funny things you will see across, the broadband space in Nigeria is that people say this is the fastest 4G broadband service, and they have an advert, and they compare with another service. In the other service, they show a guy who's trying to download something, and then it grows gray, and then it grows, like shrinks in the seat and things like that, and then they show there someone who just sprints across the screen. But when you do buy this, unfortunately, it's the other, case entirely. So I think it's important to understand that in many cases, unfortunately, on the long term, when you have the argument that half education, half in the internet and all that is better than none. What you're doing is you're creating a complex system that will take you back to the very beginning, because when someone has half education, misses the opportunities, has terrible inferiority complex because they assume, I'm qualified, right? I should get it, and they don't get it. They have inferiority complex. It means they go straight back to the very beginning. I think that's the first point to make. The other is in terms of our experience in Nigeria. When GSM mobile phones came in 2001, the guy who was immediate past Senate president announced, because he was Minister of Communications at the time, and he said, you know what, phones are not for the poor, right? We need to create a special project called Rural Telephony Project for the Poor, and then GSM for those who can afford it. As I speak to you, Rural Telephony Project is dead. It produced 200,000 mobile phones for the same price that GSM companies paid for their licenses, 285 million naira. And the least number of people connected to any, GSM company in Nigeria today is 10 million. Now you can compare that. Unfortunately, what we've seen is there's the argument that we're doing this for the poor. But guess what? The same poor people you're trying to help have been topping up their phones. If it's important, they make room for it. And
Right.
that is
That's a
what
good
we
point.
saw happen between
Yeah.
2001 and 2004. So in 2001, people were going to give them half mobile phones and say, give them RTP, Rural Telephony Project. But by 2004, the guys you were trying to help were paying. In fact, when we looked at the numbers, poor people in Ajegunle that we worked in paid a lot more on a monthly basis than the person who is paying in Lekki. Because if you're paying in Lekki, you're buying 1,000 naira top-up card at the beginning of the month, and you get a lot of, benefits on that. But the guy is buying 10 naira, he's buying 15 naira, he's making a call, the call ends, he buys another 20 naira, and at the end of the day, and I think it's important to note that, the problem is not that the poor can't pay. The
It's relevance, right?
It's the relevance. If it's relevant enough, people will pay for it. And I think it's very patronizing, to say the least, when you assume that, they can't pay, let's give them something free or something off. But this is where government comes in. Almost every government that has been part of this conversation collects at least 1.5% profit before tax or even after tax from telecom companies for the Universal Services Provision Fund, at least in Nigeria. And that is where the gap is. There's a gap that many companies are trying to fill, saying, okay, let's do zero rating. But that gap exists because government has failed in a primary responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's about government. Yeah, it's about government. It's
Absolutely.
about government.
And I think, let me just make a final point on this. And it's important to say this, is that, and this is, this is the freemium argument, right, versus free. I think that what is being sold as free is actually freemium.
Freemium?
Absolutely.
Did you make that word up?
I didn't make it up. It's something that everyone knows about. You get it for free, and then you get addicted, and then you have to pay for the next level, right?
Premium,
and I think it's important to realize that what we're having is not so. The businesses that are that are providing the services, they're not activists, they're not non-profits, they're businesses. Right. They're looking for people to come on to use their products, or the people become the product, so you can advertise to them. And I think it's important to realize that it's really not about providing free service because it's zero rated, but it's about getting more customers, and the people that you're basically claiming to provide the free service to, they're actually the target because you want to get them hooked up on your product. So it's not free. It's actually the freemium model. And we need to stop, thinking it's free.
But in fairness, I think the companies that engage in those kinds of practices will recognize that it's a market-based model. They're trying, because that's what makes it sustainable, right? It's not sustainable to give the internet away for free on a regular basis.
Yeah, but unfortunately, it's not being framed that way. It's being framed as...
So it's the transparency and the marketing. That's a very important point. And I want to highlight the importance as well of the relevance issue and how that is an important barrier to access and connectivity, as much as some would say is affordability. I do want to also push back a little bit on the example of the half an education being not as good as a whole education. So that's certainly true, but I wonder if the baseline for comparison of the half-educated person in your example isn't the person who isn't educated at all, rather than the one who's fully educated, right? So it's the starving person vis-a-vis the person with the piece of bread, not the person with the piece of bread and the guy eating the whole meal, which is somewhere, right? Why is the comparison always up instead of with the people who aren't connected, right?
So the reason for that is very simple. When you give someone half a loaf or half education, you're giving them the impression, and I think impression matters, you're giving them the impression that they've gone up the ladder to be with a person who has a full loaf. And unfortunately, you're setting them up for disappointment. We've seen this happen a lot. And unfortunately, it brings people back to the very beginning, and they develop a terrible complex, which takes them many years back. Because what happens is, instead of getting educated, they're literally getting uneducated or miseducated. Because the guy who is not educated, incidentally, would have accepted, you know what, I'm not educated, I'm going to find myself another trade. I'm going to, mend chairs, I'm going to do this and that. But the guy who is half educated assumes that he can get that white collar job, and he keeps pushing, and unfortunately, he's comparing himself not with the guy who's not educated, but the guy who's fully educated.
Right. Well, that's a strong point, and I think that debate hinges depending on whether you see that glass as half full or half empty, right? But from an access point of view, it's difficult, right? Because you're saying that some access is not better than no access, and at some level that seems a difficult position. But in practice, you make a strong point about why that could be. So let's turn to Chile. Only country on the panel that's banned zero rating, one of a handful of countries to do it. And I'd be interested in now hearing about the panorama in Chile and your thoughts on what the human rights implications are of that zero rating. Because you don't even have Wikipedia Zero, for instance, right? I know you could. I know it's a little more nuanced than that. But the idea is, what is the impact on people's accessibility or even just, participation because of that structure?
Okay, to answer directly your question, I think it's very important to take into account the penetration levels in Chile, which are
fairly high. Yeah,
it's very high, and comparing with the rest of my colleagues here on the table.
That's right.
One thing.
That's right.
So when you're analyzing zero rating practices, I think you need to take that into account, as well as the market concentration and all that sort of things that we've been trying to discuss in the last minutes. So that's one thing. Secondly, in terms of the zero rating practices already existing or not in Chile, that raised to my previous point in terms of the role of the governments and the way that they may or not enforce zero rating practices. So the example of Chile in that matter is very interesting, because we have a strong regulator in terms of telecommunications, and they actually said and state that zero rating practices are forbidden in the country in terms of vis-a-vis application of the net neutrality law.
And it's been enforced, right? There was a case against a couple of...
Yes, it's been one case. But the thing is, what happened at the end, which I think is very interesting in terms of this conversation, is that what companies did was say, okay, this is forbidden, but what we will do is not to apply these zero rating products for prepaid phones, but for people who already have plans. So it's interesting, because what they're doing is not just to saying, you know what, WhatsApp now will be free, Facebook will be free, just paying zero, but it will be free whether you have topped up that first. So it's really interesting, because the way that the market is worked in that matter is overlying what actually the law says, what the reglementation of the provision actually said, and actually basically what the regulator actually said. So what happened at the end is we already have zero rating services, but frame it in a different way.
So the regulator is misapplying the law in allowing this kind of practice zero rating that occur kind of around the edges, as if it didn't?
Basically, that's what is happening. And it's interesting, because it's reached what your first point in terms of the communication matter, you know, because it's really easy to say Chile is the first country in the world to have net neutrality regulation. It's very easy for the regulator to say, I'm enforcing this beautiful net neutrality regulation, but at the same time, under the table, they're negotiating the TPP, which is an explicit provision on the footnote in terms of net neutrality. So I think that the communication matter is very important. The concentration part of the market is very important as well. And basically, when you're seeing the reality of a very particular context as Chile have in the region, I think you need to, it's very more nuanced, the answer at the end, not just in terms of legislative or normative application of the law, but also in terms of what we discussed in the first question, in terms of what are basically the human rights standards that we actually agree that will comply or not with zero rating services. Let's say necessity test, let's say proportionality test. And I think that's still a work in progress.
Does the regulator think in those terms, or do advocates?
What do you think?
I know that was okay. What about the advocates that appear before the regulator or that engage on these issues? To what extent is the human rights discourse being used? Because Chile has a long tradition of rule of law and recognition of human rights principles internally. So-
Yes, I think it's very low. The regulator doesn't have pretty much connection with other sort of regulatory bodies except of the telecommunication market. So all the conversation is just in a matter, it's a matter of, like compliance or not with the law, with very few enforcement powers, basically.
Yep.
So that's basically the conversation in Chile. But the thing is, what I think is interesting to talk is again, maybe not just in the matter of the human rights structure, how to solve this, because this is not a binary solution, as you said at the beginning, but is how do we, in the different layers of regulation and practices, we may recognize or not some practices or regulation that complies or not with the human rights
Right.
standards. And I think that's still a work in progress, even
Right.
for the civil society. This is my last point.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting to have this conversation because this is a personal note, I'm pretty tired to talk about the neutrality and human rights in a very vacuum manner.
Right.
And I think it's very interesting to go deeper into that, to go out of our comfort zone and have a conversation not just about data, but about basically how these human rights standards basically apply or not.
Yeah, no, well, thank you. I think that's the idea. And so I'm going to ask to go ahead and have folks put up the slide again so that those of you with questions for the panelists on anything you've heard so far, you can start to send those in. And I'm just going to do one more round, more open-ended now, to allow the panelists to reflect and react. Oh, just a few questions I see. But before we start taking those, which we will, and I want to hear from each of the panelists just your thoughts, your reactions, and comments to what you've heard your fellow panelists talk about, or this point about that Claudio makes about trying to really flesh out what, in practice and in context, the human rights implications are of net neutrality principles, of potential exceptions to those like zero rating in some circumstances. So I'm going to start with you, Benga, and move back the other way. What has this panel got you thinking about, maybe that you weren't thinking about before?
I mean, so it's interesting. Back to a point I made earlier, and I think it's really interesting. We have this conversation all the time about connecting the next billion, about the next billion actually, and the next billion are not represented in the conversation, and we have this back and forth, right. Businesses selling things as free when it's freemium and things like that. And I think that at the end of the day, this is almost about survival. Businesses trying to survive by getting into new markets, governments trying to survive by collecting money but not spending on what they should do, at the end of the day.
Okay. Faria, you want to share your thoughts?
I think what was most interesting for me is that, so we're not the only ones in the same, in that, also what Benga was saying, right? A lot of parallels that I could draw to that, which is that's surprising in terms of, where the net neutrality debate or zero rating debate is at. And also what he mentioned about the government, basically, we also have a fund. Telcos provide money and contribute money to that fund, and it's essentially their responsibility for internet penetration and getting more people. So you can't have the company stepping into this space, rolling out these schemes, making you believe that you're getting connected, etc.
Right.
This is, if we're looking at it in a human rights perspective, the internet is a basic human right, as has been declared by the UN,
yeah.
Then it's incumbent upon the government to keep to some of those commitments and roll them out as they should be.
Right.
Rather than just letting market forces drive this.
That's right. And there are challenges involved in that, right? I mean, we had a conversation with Carlos about the regulator in Mexico or in India and other places that, have different considerations.
I want to answer one of the questions here.
Oh, you're going to start with the questions?
Pardon me?
Let's get your thoughts first on what you've heard and if you have any thoughts in reaction to, and then we'll talk questions.
Think about it. I'm sorry. Well, it's related to the questions in
Fine,
the end.
go ahead.
Because
So
Can't
just
stop
answer
you.
the question.
Yeah, do what you want.
because let's get things straight. Again, a violation of human rights doesn't mean entirely that the effects of that violation will get a person incarcerated or a whole company banned. For
Right.
example, Coca-Cola or
Yeah.
McDonald's. We are dealing with behaviors here. We're dealing with conduct here. What is the conduct that is? If there is some conduct or some behavior or some policy that may have a legitimate aim. That's the main issue. When you go to the doctor, whenever you go to the doctor, I go to the doctor very soon. If you go, and you have an antibiotic, for example, the antibiotic has legitimate aim to cure you a disease, an infection in this case. But it's not a blank check, right? It's going to interfere with your system, but it's not a blank check. It has a proportion. It has someone who is accountable, is the doctor, for example.
Yeah.
There's a body of regulator that make accountable to this guy. There is a certain time to actually put your drug into your system.
Yeah.
No? There is a whole process. It's not just like a blank check. It's exactly the same with when we talk about human rights interferences or violations and how to fix them to have the legitimate aim in balance with the human rights. It's not like a binary term issue. So I always bring this of the antibiotics or the medicines because that's it's very common because we talk about this. It's not. Many people will be angry because why will you say this? Because I have.
It's streamed, but.
And I will say this, and I will stream. But there are so many American people, that have an understanding of human rights that it's American-centered. But there are so many regional instruments. For example, European, Latin American, African. There are different systems for human rights and understanding how they work. Right. So, for example, in the case, there are some systems that will be some human rights above other human rights. There will be a hierarchy. And some others that they are the same. They are part of the same thing. Right. There's like a block of human rights. So when we try to talk about human rights, that's the way we should address their legitimate aims. We are not saying that their connectivity is not a legitimate aim. They are legitimate. Okay, how can we balance them? So that's the way that we should process our thoughts when we talk about this and not, oh, there's human rights violation. Let's get these people in jail. Someone is saying that.
Yeah, right. No, it's much more nuanced than that. And there are, the idea here is that net neutrality is the rule, and anything that would impinge on it is the exception. And human rights law is pretty specific about when you can and cannot do that. And I think that's what you're trying to highlight, right, with meeting the requirements of that. If any of you have any responses or reactions to the questions or to what, please go right ahead.
I will go deeper into what Carlos said. What I'm saying regarding how tired I personally is in terms of, to talk about this in vacuum, I'm talking as well in the terms of you're actually referring to the discussion. Because when you're talking about, this is not applies just in the neutrality conversation or the zero rating conversation, but in every single internet policy or compelling internet policy issue is exactly the same. When you're saying, my standing point is the protection and the development of human rights, what some third party are thinking about you is that you're saying that every single thing that is not directly complying with what the text of the Inter-American Convention or whatever other single international instrument of human rights said is totally forbidden. And it's not true. That is totally not true. That's one thing. And the second thing that I wanted to say is maybe related to, I'll skip thinking regarding your question, the third question, which is the role of the regulator in countries in Latin America and basically, in particular in Chile, which is two basic and very quick points. The first one is all the conversation in terms of neutrality and in terms of zero rating or whatever you wanted to call it in the telecommunication area is just using the jargon of the telecommunication people. And it works in the same way that the trade discussion actually we had in the next room some hours ago. In terms of all the major internet policies topics has been taken into account on trade agenda, for instance, which doesn't have nothing to do or nothing in common with the old jargon of the human rights culture, the human rights community, but the trade community. And this is exactly the same here. So what I'm trying to say with this is we need to push a little bit all those people, not to talk in the vacuum about the human rights, but trying to go deeper. And this is that's the reason why I think it's so important to have this sort of conversation and the research that you've been actually doing in the States in terms of to understand clearly regarding where are the boundaries on that conversation, not just to face them, to face the regulators regarding you should apply human rights standards, and zero rating are or not complying with that. But in terms of the nuanced conversation, in terms of what that really means, not just in terms of internet penetration, but in terms of respecting human rights and respecting local regulations.
Right. Oh, all right. Do you want to add something to that or react to that? I feel like the experience in Latin America is very particular given the history and the regional system operation there. Pakistan is not subject to a regional human rights system that has had the same function. Do these arguments sound persuasive to you?
They
What do they make you think?
Definitely. So, I mean, in terms of, these conversations shouldn't be in a vacuum, like Claudia said.
Right.
And they should be more nuanced. Because right now in this space, a lot of times what we do is we just take positions or get on one side of the debate because that's, it's also a feel good, look good, I'm taking that position, but it's not really a genuine debate that you've had.
That's right, yeah.
So that is absolutely necessary, and at least in our context, and human rights, yes, sure, we have universal frameworks and, we've ratified, but the conception and perception of human rights in local context is very different.
Than what we're hearing from Mexico.
Absolutely.
And
the
Chile.
application is very, very different. And so all of this comes into play when we're talking about some of these issues. So essentially, because when we're approaching these debates, I feel like all of these factors need to be accounted for.
And as a digital rights activist who will be engaging in this debate, what might you take away from this discussion and build into your advocacy?
One question, I would actually
Sure, ask a
like
question.
everybody with a question. These are some of the things that we've discussed in sort of some other panels, right? Now, in this part of the world, let's say, there is a very principled and strong position on net neutrality and zero rating, etc. And that's something that would not be allowed here, right? Now, in another panel we were discussing, and the East India Company reference came up, and it almost seems like, offshore practices are different than in the home country. There are certain things you would never do, right? But you're rolling out these services in other places in the world and taking cover using local laws, local jurisdictions, room that you have to navigate because of the legal frameworks that are or aren't there. And I feel like we need to revert and say, well, if you won't do it in your home country, and also the perception, but the global south needs to be more connected, but there are parts of America that, people don't have access to the internet. And, whatever, so do you think they shouldn't maybe be brought on if that's, the real aim of it, of, bringing more people online or getting them connected? So these are some of the questions I feel like, in our minds.
Yeah, no, and those are good questions. And I think, that net neutrality in the United States looks different than it does in other places. And that just means that the discussions have sort of different characteristics, but it doesn't mean that the same considerations and concerns may not apply, like, the fact that there are still unconnected people. And connectivity is not the only legitimate aim that a state might invoke to adopt or promote some kind of zero rating. So, for instance, I was at a workshop last week, and the question came up, what about zero rating security alerts, right? Or missing child alerts, right? Which would apply equally in a developed or developing country. Is that something that we're going to ban on principle? So this is taking it outside just of the developing context and putting it on a more even plane. What do you think? What do you think, Benga? Is that something that would make sense in your context?
So two things. One, context matters.
Oh, yeah.
And so when you're talking about, a missing children alert and something, I don't think that's something that just one service would be interested in.
Exactly.
I think it's something that all of the services will be interested in. And if all of the services are interested in this, then there's nothing unfair in it. If everyone agrees that we're going to do this and it's not unfair practice where one person does it. So if you're on one network, if you have a missing child, you have a chance to use the service. But the others on another network don't have that chance, and you can advertise on your network and say, hey, come to our network where the guys who provide services to find missing children.
Other thoughts on that question?
May I
We have
say
some good
something?
questions that we can,
I-
you should
I-
feel free
I
to
cannot
peruse
say
here
it.
and pick
I
a
cannot-
question
I
that you
cannot
like
say it.
and answer them. But go ahead.
I can say it, but I think that two very quick points about that. The first one is we shouldn't be afraid about regulation on markets. I mean, sometimes when we're talking about this conversation, I'm really curious regarding why we're not talking about that. This is why I'm using the term market, which I'm using the jargon trade somehow, because I think
it's come up in every conversation.
This is a little bit more complicated and nuanced than we thought at the beginning. That's
Right.
one thing.
Right.
And secondly, I think that the neutrality conversation and the zero rating particularly conversation need to address as well is in terms of market integration, because when you have regions like Latin America with an insane concentration of
Yeah.
markets,
Yeah.
when you have concentration in the case of the telecommunications companies, content companies, and so on, television, cable, whatever, and then you are not pretty well, I mean, then your regulator doesn't have a pretty much, enforcement powers to do something. Then what will happen with zero rating services without even thinking, or without even having a more more fearful conversation with every single one of the actors involved, what will happen is we will have more concentrated markets, and therefore we will have less,
That's the risk. Yeah.
And that's a problem that we need to highlight when we're talking about neutrality, and particularly zero rating as well.
Yeah, that's right. Go ahead.
I want to answer Pranish's question. It says
Which one?
The one in the top, the most voted.
And,
4 votes.
Resounding support, 4 likes. So go ahead.
Yes. It says, I don't know, you probably will have to explain, but should we want schools that are high quality? I think that you're referring that maybe because some sorts of zero rating may not bring the high or the full internet are banned. Now that's the analogy you're trying to make. We are talking about the standards. There are some schools we call escuelas patito in Spanish in Mexico. There are schools that are actually don't have standards. They have the Public Education Secretary, it's our Ministry of Education. They set the standards for the schools to operate. If they don't operate, they should ban them. They ban them. There is an enforcement of the standard, and the discussion is on the standard. What's the level that we can have acceptable? So that may be a trick at some point. Yeah. No, my answer is that if there is a standard, there's a standard that has been discussed and deliberated, and we agree that that standard may be a ban for those. And also, the schools, in the case of Mexico, it happens that there are some exceptions for the standard, and they say, okay, maybe we shall not ban this school and close this school until it permanently, or even for some point, until it delivers the standard for the people who are actually spending the time on that school. So the discussion is the standard. It's not just like, and that's the point on what should we build in the regulators for zero rating. We need to build principles and then talk about exceptions. That's the whole point. So yes, please.
Let's get you a mic then, if you want to have this conversation. We have a few minutes. Not your mic, Carlos. He's talking with you.
Maybe you don't want to talk anymore.
Oh, here we go. Oh, and okay.
Okay, just to explain in 2 parts, also to bring in something else that I'd asked, which is we're, for some reason that I don't understand, saying that net neutrality is equated with freedom of expression, and anything that isn't qualifying with some definition of net neutrality, which we haven't arrived at, which includes something that the US doesn't consider, for instance, net neutrality, which is same cost for everything, okay, that isn't included in the US definition of net neutrality, that any deviation from a definition of net neutrality should be justified. Now, my question is that there are people getting access. So, for instance, in Egypt, free basics has been banned because Facebook was not providing surveillance. There's a Reuters report about this today. And the lower classes would have freedom of association through and greater access to knowledge through the variety of news services that are available on free basics, the variety of through Wikipedia being available. In Angola, Wikipedia Zero is being used very creatively to upload all manners of content for file sharing, etc. So all of that has been banned in Egypt. Right. Now, my question is, shouldn't a ban on something that enables communications that enables freedom of association, that enables expression, that enables the right to receive and seek and impart information, shouldn't that ban be justified rather than saying that the opposite should be justified under Article 19? So I'm a little bit confused about how we're deploying this as a human rights, standard. So, secondly, with regard to the right to education. So in India, there are a variety of, we have a Right to Education Act. We even amended our constitution to put it in there. There are requirements under the Act which are onerous. The requirements, for instance, for playgrounds of certain sizes that are onerous that many schools can't fulfill. There are other kinds of requirements that rich schools should admit poor students who can't pay the fees. Okay? Those kinds of requirements, no one is positive discrimination, no one is complaining about. But the banning of those schools which in an urban area don't have enough money to have a sizable playground when the children are actually playing on the streets, right? Those kinds of requirements, instead of seeing whether they make sense or not, we're banning them. And in India, even a kind of zero rating that no one, I believe, should find objectionable, that is, if anyone who wanted to provide a low bandwidth version of their website could just say, I'm launching just as for mobile versions, they launch M dot, versions. So they launch a 0 dot version, say that this is low bandwidth, self-certification. If an ISP decides to zero rate all of that and not to charge for that, what is the harm? There's self-certification. There is no entry barrier. There is no arcane, companies rules that you need to qualify for. So even that is banned in India. Now my question really is, should we be justifying bans and seeing where the appropriate line should lie, or should we be justifying allowing zero rating? I believe the line should be drawn somewhere in the middle, not with a complete ban. But I realize that's not a very popular opinion around here.
But I think actually you miss a part of the conversation, because we are actually saying that we actually began explaining that this is not a binary issue.
Right.
We actually, in this table, you say the word, I say the word many times, and no. That's not the banning or not banning. And we also have said here that it's highly contextual. In the desert, with no connectivity, suddenly you have free basics. What's the damage on competition? If there is nothing, yes, we can bring to the absurd and it still works, yes. And we actually said it's a principle that has exceptions, that we have to bring other discussions from other human rights in the digital environment that are working. And that's what we're dealing with here. So, but I want to address another question that you said that this is synonymous for net neutrality, synonymous for freedom of expression. Yes, in some points, for example, in Mexico, the net neutrality protections are exactly in the freedom of expression chapter. For example, what they want to address is the no blockings, the freedom, the free choice, all of that is in that, for example. So it will have to be read into that, not as a synonymous, but as an habilitator of. So, but also there are so many ways to violate the neutrality. I will ask you, blocking of content, of services, or protocols. Certain protocols, there are exceptions. Block spam portals is acceptable? Yes, it is acceptable, because there is also a principle that any interference with that, with traffic management, will also have to contempt the stability and integration of the whole infrastructure. So there's always exceptions. No one is talking about here a binary view.
I just want to add to what Pranesh asked, and this is something that we did discuss. It has to be a far more nuanced, and there has to be a debate about this, an informed debate. It's not just about taking positions, assuming positions, and just sort of enforcing them in the whole net neutrality, zero rating business. And, it's, so internet.org as an example, so we got it, but it's also about standards, right? So it requires you to forgo SSL at a certain point. Are those the kind of things, is that a direction you want to move in. So that's happened. Well, that's how it was rolled out initially when we got it. So you would have to forego SSL at a certain point. And so when there's a larger global debate about more secure networks, etc., you want to maintain those kind of standards. So I suppose it's not just, I mean, outright banning or outright acceptance. I think neither are viable. It needs to be, you need to figure out where we want to, like he said, draw a line.
Yeah.
So
Go ahead.
This isn't a 0 and 1 conversation, apparently. I see this more as, because the people that we're talking about are not in the room. So I think this is more of a contest of ideas. And I think that what you have seen with Free Basics is, first of all, it started as internet.org, right? It was changed to Free Basics for a reason. It started without protection for privacy. Now it has that protection. Okay, so I think that this is the purpose of this conversation. It's not to say don't do what you want to do. If you're a business and you want new markets, you're welcome in the new market. But don't pretend that you're doing non-profit work when it's for profit. Don't say it's free when it's freemium. And this applies to everyone. So this is one of the opportunities we have when we have this kind of conversations. Services that are provided become better because of these conversations. Yeah. And I don't think that anyone in this room has a right to say, you know what, this is it, this is my opinion, you must take it. Nobody can force their opinion on any other person, but we can have a conversation, hopefully, a debate of good ideas that will make, for better services. But I think that fundamentally, one of the things that we haven't talked about a lot, and I'm sure there are a lot of conversations that have happened at RightsCon about this, is much of this has been sold as an opportunity to connect the next billion.
Yes.
But I think we're having a very lazy conversation about connecting the next billion. It's not going to be a simple thing to do.
It's not one tool that's going to answer the whole thing, right?
It's going to be, and I think that at the heart of that debate is the fundamental disappointment with what governments in many of those countries are supposed to do that they are not doing.
Yeah.
Many of the governments have been receiving money from telecom companies for years. And this money, so in Nigeria, what we've done is we've sent an FOI, Freedom of Information Request, to the USPA, Universal Service Provision Fund, to ask for exactly how much money has come in since 2009 and how the money has been spent. They were going to send us printed documents, and we said, no, we want this in soft copy. I suspect they're going to say, we're going to send you PDF, and then we'll say no, we want it, in a readable format. Mm-hmm. And we will wait to get that, to have a conversation, to say, okay, if you're asking telecom companies to pay a certain percentage of their profit so that you can provide last mile solutions and connect the people who are not connected, why is that not happening? This gap in the market is the reason we're having many of these debates.
That's right.
These debates should not even be happening if we apply, and I think this is about time when we need to put some pressure. Everyone within the stakeholder group, we need to put pressure on governments that are messing up to stand up and do their jobs.
Right. That's an excellent point. I'm going to give Claudio the last word. I just want to ask Manuel if we can put the slide up with the Article 19, and there's a link there to a survey that we're doing at GW University on perception of net neutrality. It's tinyurl.cc/RightsCon, and I would invite all of you to fill out that survey and help us understand how net neutrality is being perceived. There it is at the bottom, it's actually tiny.cc/RightsCon. If you could fill out, and even folks out on the internet looking at this live stream, please, we want your opinions and your thoughts and reaction to the questions on there about net neutrality. We're going to give Claudio the final word, no pressure, so you
got a very quick thought.
Make it good because it's the last thing we're going to say.
Let me think about it then. No, just kidding. I think it's important. And we all agree this is not a 0-1 discussion. This is not binary discussion. It's a little bit more complicated. But I think it's really also important, and this is touch my prior point in terms of not to talk about silos when we're talking about important conversations like this. It's not just about connectivity. This is not just about connecting the next million. This is not just about telecommunications agency. This is a little bit more, like a complicated conversation also in terms of layering of regulation. And I'm saying this because the trade negotiations or what I've learned about that trade negotiation is basically, this is a trick for the more powerful people in the room just to take the decisions without any single consideration of the other. Yeah. And I think that when we're talking about important policy topics, we need to take that into consideration as well.
No, thank you very much. And so what we've heard today is that these are complex issues, that they should be looked at in context, that they should be looked at in context and interrelated with bigger policy questions about the next billion, about trade and public policy, and the role of the state through regulators and other authorities in making sure that private sector and market forces are kept in check in a reasonable fashion, among other things that we heard today. So please join me in thanking these wonderful panelists for this, what I hope was an invigorating and interesting conversation, and thank all of you for coming as well.